Dr. Jared Michelson.
Thank you very much. It's great to be with you, and I find it really funny that I'm going to be sharing the stage with Professor Oliver O'Donovan, who's been kind of a hero of mine for a long time. Do you ever go to like a concert or a gig, and you're going to see some kind of global rock star, and at the beginning they have kind of some local act that no one really cares about, and everyone's kind of going to the toilets and getting a beer and everything. Basically what I'm saying is, if you need the toilet, you still got a half an hour, okay? In what is C.S. Lewis's greatest novel, and you're welcome to disagree with anything I say today except for that. That is a fact. Accept it, okay? The Princess Psyche is offered as a sacrifice to the gods. And her sister Oriole, a few days after she's been taken up to the mountain as a sacrifice, her sister Oriole goes to find her body and to give her a proper burial. And yet when she ascends to the mountain, what she finds to her joy is her sister is alive and well, looking healthier than she ever has. And yet, Oriole's joy turns to fear as she begins speaking to her sister. She finds that her sister claims to have been married to a god. And this god has been caring for her. And this god has given her a beautiful palace, the beautiful palace that they're both standing in that very moment. And yet Oriole sees no palace. She sees no god. What she sees is her sister standing alone in a valley, dripping with rain, living in a delusion. Psyche was as certain of her palace as of the plainest thing. This valley was indeed a dreadful place, full of the divine, sacred, no place for mortals. There might be 100 things in it that I could not see. Can a Greek understand the horror of that thought? Sickening discord, a rasping together of two worlds, like the two bits of a broken bone. For the world had broken in pieces, and Psyche and I were not in the same piece. Till We Have Faces is about many things, but one of the things I would suggest it is about is the fact that part of what it means to live in a secular age or a disenchanted age, I'll explain those words as we go, is to have a sense that you are living in two separate worlds at the same time. And that's a key theme of this story. It is that Oriole is trapped between two ways of interpreting and experiencing reality. And these two ways are so profoundly shaping of the way she interprets the world that someone that is shaped in one way of thinking and interpreting the world can see a palace, where the other sees nothing. The profundity and beauty of the novel, though, is that Lewis goes to great lengths to show the compelling explanatory power of both worlds. It is not a story about one good religious way of viewing the world and some bad modern atheistic way. The kind of key figure who inculcates this new way of viewing the world into Oriole is their tutor, who's named the Fox. He's a Greek philosopher. And what he tells them offers them huge insights into the world that they, with their prior way of viewing the world, were missing. His way of viewing the world has incredible explanatory power, and it is not an atheistic way of viewing the world. The problem, he thinks, is their way of interpreting the world is descended from or relies upon a false view of the gods, a pagan view of the gods, whereas his view of the world comes from a philosophical view of God as the orderer, the source, the reason this world has intelligibility, the reason it can be studied by natural philosophy, or what we might now call by science. And the story is about being caught between these two different ways of viewing the world and thinking that both get something right. That the Fox's way of viewing the world has extraordinary, as I said, explanatory power. And yet something is missing. Some aspects of reality that give it meaning and significance that were wrapped up in this old way of viewing the world are missed. And the story is about this conflict, this tension. I'm going to introduce a phrase that you might not all be familiar with, and there's no perfect phrase that I could think of, maybe you can help me later, to describe these two ways, the different ways of seeing the world. Foucault has this phrase, the French philosopher, an episteme, Some neo-Calvinists will talk about worldviews. What's really important about this, though, is that and the reason I haven't just chosen the word worldview is because that can lead us astray if we think a worldview is a kind of set of doctrines that we believe. An episteme is more about the implicit assumptions that shape what we can experience and what we can believe. It's not just about the things we're aware of that are shaping the way we're experiencing the world. It's a way of thinking about the fact that all of us kind of inherit a set of assumptions which predetermine how we will experience and interpret reality. And most of us are caught between different epistemes, between different ways of interpreting and experiencing the world. And as I was thinking about our conference, part of what I think can make it really hard as a Christian PhD student is you have this feeling that you're caught, just like Oriel, between two worlds. That on Sunday, you're told to expect that God can act in surprising and unexpected and even miraculous ways. And on Monday, in the laboratory, you're told that that way of interpreting reality is totally inappropriate. You need to be a, as the phrase goes, methodological naturalist, even if you're not a real naturalist. But even if it's just a method to interpret the world as if God didn't exist, that still shapes the way, your assumptions, your background beliefs. And you can feel this sense of tension. You can feel it in, I think, all of the disciplines, and I can assure you I'm not an expert in whatever discipline you're in, but I think in at least certain branches of the social sciences and the humanities, a lot has been written about this by post-critical authors, there's a kind of highly critical disposition. You experience this in theology as well. A way of reading texts and a way of interpreting the past which assumes that basically it's prejudice all the way down. That's a suspicious way of reading that is constantly coming to text thinking that they are driven by biases or by histories that they're unaware of. And yet again, when you come to church on Sunday and we open our Bibles, you're told to adopt the opposite posture. Not suspicious, but trustful, hopeful, believing that something more is happening in this text than can be accounted for by purely naturalistic means. Many of us feel, as Christians in the academy, caught between two ways of interpreting the world. We see the good in both, but we can't quite reconcile them. So here's what I want to do in the few minutes we have together. I want to try to think about what's the way forward for this experience of being caught between two worlds. And the first thing I want to do, kind of briefly, is talk about what I think are some mistaken ways of describing the relationship between these two worlds, some ways that are unhelpful, and then I want to move to maybe what is at least a slightly more adequate picture that we can pick apart. So, I don't know if you guys have ever seen this meme, the guy that was talking about, he was a scientist that was kind of talking about aliens on one of those weird television shows. I think one profoundly mistaken way of thinking about these two episteme or two worldviews, whatever you want to call them, is to think that some people are in one or the other, when in fact all of us, whether you're religious or not, are caught in the middle. Here's what I mean. I remember one time I was at an event at our church, and a young person was there, and we ended up having this really great conversation. He was exploring faith, and at some point this was my American bluntness coming out, I just said, "Do you believe in Jesus?" And he said, "No, I believe in aliens." And yeah, that struck me as a non sequitur, right? You can believe in Jesus and aliens or not. But as I started talking with him, it made total sense. Some of you might have known what he meant. What he meant was, I believe that Buddha and Jesus and all of the great religious teachers are explained by the fact that aliens came and visited the earth and were doing all of these things that people thought were miracles. This is really his way of interpreting the world. And this is incredibly common. There was a study, this was just published a couple months ago, 2,000 British adults, 78% had what they characterized as paranormal beliefs. 78% of people believe in fairies or in that you can communicate with the dead, or that aliens are not just in aliens, but aliens are constantly visiting us. Even more surprising in this study, they cited a prior study of 4,000 adults, British adults again, 40% believe they have had a paranormal experience. They actually believe they have spoken to a dead person, or they believe that they have had an encounter with an alien. It is not the case that the average person today is living in a rational, scientific, straightforward way of interpreting the world. The reason these beliefs are called paranormal, however, is because nor is it the case that they're living in a kind of simply pre-modern, non-scientific way of viewing the world. A paranormal belief is a belief that is abnormal, that you can't reconcile with your broader ways of experiencing the world. The vast majority of people in the UK today, whether they're religious or not, are caught between a more rationalist or scientific, their normal way of viewing the world, and their paranormal beliefs, which they have, which can't be fully reconciled with it. I think this is also true for anyone in the academy. It is not just Christians that feel in the academy caught between two ways of looking at the world. There's a lot of different ways you could go about showing this, but this is a great recent book by Espen Hammer, who's a philosopher and kind of intellectual historian in New York. And he describes the kind of progress of post-Kantian philosophy. He looks at Kant, Hegel, Marx, Feuerbach, Nietzsche, all of these people that we associate with, Kant being the slight exception, with being very opposed to religion. Every one of those figures used the phrase the death of God. We associate the death of God only with Nietzsche. All of them spoke about the death of God. And yet what he points out in every case is that there is a critique of traditional or pre-modern forms of religion, but then a process of rescue. They first critique what they think to be the unenlightened or the unscientific or the unrational way of thinking about God, and yet they immediately feel something that religion has, we desperately need. And they try to find a secular or a eminent, i.e. worldly version of what religion has to offer. The very kind of foundations of the Western Enlightenment are built on a sense that a purely rational secular worldview will not do. We at least need a way of recovering what religion promised. So the first mistaken way of thinking about this is thinking that there are certain people that are on one side or the other. Almost all of us are caught in the middle. That looks a bit different if you're a Christian, but it's a problem for all of us. Two then, the other mistake is to evaluate one of these as wholly good or the other as wholly bad. Okay, I'm sure you guys have seen these kind of memes, all the thousands of memes, about rejecting modernity and embracing tradition. We might automatically as Christians be suspicious of a kind of progressive ideology which thinks this newer, more supposedly rational or scientific, read scare quotes around all of that, way of looking at the world is just better than what came before. But it is equally a mistake to think that the modern is bad and that there was a perfect way of experiencing the world that characterizes pre-modernity. And this is very tempting, I think, for people today. And we see this in the rise of people kind of returning to supposedly esoteric or traditional forms of religion. Part of the reason that is a mistake if you are a Christian is because there is a whole host of stories, Hegel being one but loads, that talk about the key driver. I'm not saying this is true, but I think it has a bit of the truth. The key driver in the move towards a more rationalistic, more scientific, more quote-unquote disenchanted way of viewing the world, the key driver being Christianity. That in an ancient worldview in which you thought that there's a God in every stream, you thought, remember the way Oriel was describing it, that gods are everywhere, they're involved, they're choosing who wins battles, they're the source for the rain. A belief in one single transcendent source of deity that orders the world. This is a more rational, a more scientific, a more disenchanted way of viewing the world. Christianity itself is not purely this old way of viewing the world, nor this new way. And that's why in the Enlightenment, the kind of reaction against the Enlightenment, as I said, people immediately started thinking that this kind of more rational way of viewing the world, though it gets many things right, it leaves many things out. It was very common, again, to blame Judaism or Christianity as the source of this problem. The Enlightenment poet Schiller, this was a hugely influential poem cited by German philosophers. Look at the final line. Why have the gods left us? Why do we feel bereft and empty of meaning in the modern world? To enrich the worship of the one God of Christianity, a universe of gods must pass away. You also see this, I won't get into this, but in politics as well. When we think that a secular version of politics is purely a kind of modern invention. It's purely a part of this new way of viewing the world. In other words, so the second kind of key mistake is to evaluate these as wholly good or wholly bad. Finally, the third mistake, I think, is to define the two ways of experiencing and interpreting the world too simply. There's a whole history of different binaries being used, where people will try to say the old way of interpreting the world was this, the new way is this. Notice I've resisted using any term to describe them because it's really hard. And whatever term people use to describe, there's then a whole history of critiquing those uses of the term. So some people would say, oh, the prior way was sacred or enchanted or religious, and the modern way is secular or disenchanted or scientific. Sometimes people want to associate the old version with Roman Catholicism and the new version with Protestantism. I think all of these ways of dividing it up have things they get right, and they have limitations. And it's a real temptation to create this absolute binary, which doesn't help us actually get at what's going on. So here's what I want to do then. If these are the three mistakes or the three pitfalls in the way we describe these two episteme, or these two ways of interpreting reality, how can we come to grips with it a bit better? I want to give another binary, another pair of episteme. I've already hinted at it through my talking about Lewis. And I'm not saying this is the absolutely true binary, and once you have this, now we'll totally understand the two ways of interpreting the world, and we'll never have to debate about it again. But I think it's one that is not explored enough, and that helps us have a more nuanced view of what it means to be caught between these two ways of interpreting the world, and I think of interpreting reality. And I think it gives us some resources for thinking about the way forward. Augustine, in the City of God, he talks about three different ways of thinking about the gods, but two of them end up being the same. So basically there's two ways. One is what he calls the gods of the poets. And the gods of the poets, remember that was the same word that the Fox used in C.S. Lewis. The gods of the poets are the Greek and Roman gods that you'll probably be familiar with. They're the Greco-Roman pantheon. They're Zeus, Aphrodite, Jupiter, whatever you want to call them. And what characterizes these gods is that they are incredibly involved with every aspect of daily life, right? If you read the Iliad or ancient plays, you get this. They're involved with who wins a battle and who loses. They're involved with who falls in love. They're absolutely just shot through the world. And so there's a sense that the gods care, that the world is meaningful, that there's things going on in the world that can't just be explained by causal relationships. And yet, for Augustine, problematically, precisely because they're so enmeshed with the world, these gods are all too human. They have wills that are sometimes foiled. They have needs and desires. They can be bought off and sacrificed. They turn on one another. The good thing, if we can say that, is that they're totally involved. The bad thing is the reason they're involved is because they seem like they're just like us, but a bit bigger. And so Augustine turns to, in his Confessions, to another way of thinking about the gods. This he calls the gods of the philosophers. And I think he's thinking there's many different ways of thinking about God in ancient philosophy as there is today. He's probably thinking about Neoplatonism. But in his Confessions, in his story of his conversion, his encounter with this God, the God of the philosophers, is actually really important. It's a really key part of his journey towards faith. Because what he found through thinking in this more philosophical way was a God who was not needy, but was endlessly perfect, who was not grasping or whose will could be foiled, but a God who was transcendent, unchanging, purely good and beneficent, and who gave order and meaning to the world below. The good thing about this God is it made the world is explicable, it's understandable, it's susceptible to reason, and therefore to science. And yet there was something missing with this God as well. And what was missing, he thought, was the revolution which comes about through the person of Jesus Christ. Because when you have this is, don't take this little graph too seriously, I literally just stole it off Google. But when you have this kind of Neoplatonic view of God, the good thing is it gives, as I said, intelligibility and order to the world. The bad thing is God is totally disinterested in the world. God doesn't have a will. God doesn't love. God is the just kind of rational principle or ordering principle of all things. God is not involved in the day-to-day operations of what's going on. And in Jesus Christ, these two ways of viewing the gods, but then two correspondingly distinct ways of viewing the world, right? Interpreting the world. One that is ordered, but potentially devoid of meaning, one that is rich with supernatural potency and power and meaning, and yet seems to present the world as random, because the gods are just doing things all the time. Christianity brings these two together into a perfect synthesis. The God that is revealed in Jesus Christ is Jesus is the Logos. He is the ordering principle of the world. He is more transcendent than Aristotle or Plotinus could have imagined. He is the perfect source of all things. He is totally beneficent. What that means is God is so infinitely full of life just by being God, he could never try to use us. He could never be bought. He could never need a sacrifice. Whatever he asks us to do, whether it's to sacrifice or to obey the law, has to be for our sake, because there's nothing we have to offer that he doesn't already have. He's as transcendent or more than the God of the philosophers. And yet that same perfect source of all things takes on flesh, is touched. He goes to the tomb of a dying friend and he weeps. He counts the hairs on our head. He is as intimately involved and engaged as the poets could have ever dreamed. These two ways of thinking about God are brought together. And the best of both of these ways of interpreting reality are unified. You can tell a story of the Enlightenment and of the sense that we have that we're caught between two worlds, which centers on the loss of this synthesis, which centers on the fact that part of the reason we feel caught between two worlds in this age in particular is because we've lost the synthesis. Again, I'm not saying that's the only factor, but it's a significant one. For example, this is a great book. I don't agree with all of it, but it's really good, by Jason Josephson Storm. And he highlights as a key moment in which this division happened, and this sense that the world is kind of empty of meaning or disenchantment or whatever. He cites a moment called the pantheism controversy. The pantheism controversy was this kind of debate in German philosophy. It included all of the key Enlightenment philosophers of the time. I won't have time to get into the detail. It's actually a really funny story. People were accusing people of different beliefs, and it was kind of being carried out in the press, and they were writing mean things about each other. Nothing like today. But what it was basically about was Spinoza's way of viewing God. You might have heard of Spinoza, incredibly influential early modern philosopher. Spinoza is the God of the philosophers on steroids. Spinoza's God has no freedom to do anything other than what God does. Spinoza's God never arbitrarily gives laws. He never intervenes and does miracles. The entire world basically is just the automatic, mechanistic result of who God is. God doesn't have a will, he doesn't love, he doesn't know, and therefore everything in this world automatically happens as God just kind of overflows into the world. Now, this has the best of that God of the philosophers type worldview, right? It means the world is totally susceptible to our understanding. It's totally intelligible. The world is like a giant machine. And therefore, science can have a great time. There's a world that is totally explicable on its own terms. And yet, immediately after this Spinozan view began to gain prominence, and it did become incredibly prominent, there was a strong reaction against it. Because there was a sense that while, again, this can explain the intelligibility and the rationality of the world, it leaves something profound out. This is when people like Schiller, who wrote that poem, yearning for the return of the Greek gods, are writing. Even amongst the very people that are kind of inculcating this worldview of rationality and science in others, what they're doing in their spare time, as you might know, is participating in seances. They themselves are often proponents of paranormal beliefs. You have people like Schleiermacher, the founder of modern liberal theology, who basically more or less, not entirely, but adopts Spinoza's view of God, therefore says the world is just this kind of totally determined place with no freedom that is automatically unfolding as it is, which is totally susceptible to science, and yet he feels this profound sense that something is missing, and so he tries to combine a sense of religious feeling and affections along with that worldview. Do you see what's happening? They're all finding the two worlds going in opposite directions. And they're seeking ways to bring them back together. This is part of the condition of modernity. This is part of why every one of us in a modern university that is following on from the Enlightenment feels a sense of being caught between two worlds. And if this is true, then part of the solution might be recovering the Christian synthesis. Might it be that this early Christian way of viewing God as more transcendent than the philosophers dreamed, and yet more involved and engaged than the poets could have imagined, has the capacity to start to reunify, to start to re-engage the synthesis that has been lost? We could think about that for each of our own disciplines. Maybe you guys can talk more about it today, because as I said, I don't understand all of your disciplines. In my mind, scientists are basically witchcraft and wizards. But it allows for the regularity, and the ordered universe, which allows for investigation of the natural world. There is one transcendent source and creator. There's one logos underlying all things. God made the world ordered. Therefore, all of that way of interpreting the world is correct. And yet it doesn't do that at the expense of divine interruptions and miracles, because the one who ordered all things is personal. He has a will. He loves. And therefore, we can get the best of science without needing to have this holy mechanist universe, which screens out the possibility of miracles and of interruptions and of this sense of life. I also think, again, I'm going to dare for a second to speculate on the social sciences and the humanities beyond my own speciality. But as I said before, at least in certain branches of the humanities, by no means all, there's a highly critical and suspicious method that is adopted. A view that most of us are motivated by implicit prejudices and biases that we're unaware of, that we're sort of at the play of these forces which we can't control. That sounds an awful lot like the pagan worldview. You find something quite similar when you read the ancient tragedies. Ancient tragedies often hinge on the fact, this is your work, right? On the fact that the people are being controlled by forces that they're totally unaware of, and they end up in this tragic situation. This synthesis can affirm the good in that, can affirm the fact that the world is alive with power and life, that enchantment isn't always a good thing, that there are dark forces at work, and that we are, the whole doctrine of original sin, that we are motivated by things we are unaware of. There is so much that is good in that, and yet it doesn't need to trip over into relativism, which says it's just perspective all the way down, which says there's no external world that we can come to grips with. You have the best of both. If we had more time, there's a lot of other examples we could give. Let me give one more area. I think it gives us a better grip on how we can think about God's involvement in the world and on our experience of God. I can't tell you how many young people in St. Andrews have come up to me, and I'm sure you've had the same experience, and said, if God exists, why hasn't I ever experienced him? Why hasn't he shown himself to me? And my answer to that is always, how'd you know? How'd you know that you haven't experienced God? That seems to imply that you've decided that you have quite a robust theology which allows you to predetermine what an experience of God would be like. In other words, you have an episteme, which is saying this is what an experience of God would be like. So what have they inherited? Where have they gotten this picture where they've predetermined what an experience of God would be like? I would suggest from the story I just told. When you look at Enlightenment philosophers, they oftentimes, whether they are critiquing traditional arguments for the existence of God or defending them, unfortunately agree on one thing. They agree that the world is like a machine. When you read Hume critiquing traditional arguments for the existence of God, and when you read William Paley, the famous person who had the analogy of the world as like a watch, they both describe the world as a mechanism that is unfolding according to laws of cause and effect. If the world is a machine, then where does God fit into that? Think of Paley's image. Most of the time, the world runs absolutely fine without God. It's like a clock that's been wound up and that keeps going on its own. We just need God for one little bit to design the thing at the beginning, and then we don't need him anymore. Even someone, other people would critique that idea in the Enlightenment, but they, like Newton, but they would say, yeah, well, but sometimes the watch kind of starts to break, and God breaks in, and then he fixes it. But what you've done when you're imagining the world in that way, in this by the way, God of the philosophers type way, is you've basically said the world in its day-to-day operation is wholly and completely secular. It's bereft of the divine. It operates on its own steam. And therefore, the only place you can find God is if God does something unnatural. If he breaks into the system, pushes the natural order out of the way, and contradicts it in some way. This is wholly different from the biblical way of thinking about God's relationship to the world. I love the psalm, I think it's Psalm 104, which describes a kind of ancient view of an ecosystem. It says it's describing the rain and the way the rain helps grow the plants and how the plants are then eaten by the animals and then the carnivores eat the, it's describing it in an ancient way, but at every step it's saying, who sends the rain? Who feeds the lions? And what you're meant to get is God isn't somehow doing that because nature isn't. God is the absolute condition and source of the natural world. The way the Cambridge theologian Herbert McCabe put it is that God is just as involved in every Merlot you've ever drank as he was at the wedding at Cana. He's just as involved with the sun and the grapes fermenting, which is some magical divine process, and all of that. The question is not, have I an experience of God? The question is, have you had any experience which was an experience of God? The heavens declare the glory of God. Day to day they pour forth speech. When you're not thinking of the world in this dead, disenchanted way, it totally reframes our possibility of experiencing God in the ordinary world in all of its naturalness. And yet, you don't then need to go to the extreme of saying, therefore, God is equated with the natural, that the natural is just a machine. God can still also act in surprising and unexpected ways. God does things that are unnatural. And as Christians, we think God does things that are unnatural quite a lot. We think he does something unique and supernatural when someone comes to faith, when someone is called to the ministry. By the way, that's a big part of our tradition, which we've forgotten. You need an internal call. You need God to perform a unique action to call you to the ministry. When you come to the Lord's table, God is involved in everything, and yet that doesn't rule out the possibility of unique and profound spiritual experience rooted in God's action. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, so much of this is about our sense of ourselves. So much of the sense of feeling caught between these two worlds is rooted not just in the intellect, but in the sense that as modern people, there is something missing in the way we experience our day-to-day life. And this perfect synthesis means two things. One, it means God, as I said before, doesn't need you. He's not a Zeus figure that needs sacrifice. He's not a greedy deity who needs to be appeased. He is the limitless source of all things. And he is so perfect and full that even when he asks you to obey his laws, it's for your sake, not his. And yet, this same perfect source, as Jesus says, numbers the hairs on your head. You are more precious to him than many sparrows. The limitless source of all creation, who needs absolutely nothing, knows your names. And just like he wept at Lazarus' tomb, he is full of compassion and he cares about the details of our lives. This makes possible this rich experience of union with and communion with God in a world which can feel empty and lacking. In sum, you can't put it better than G.K. Chesterton, really with respect to most things. He has this wonderful image in orthodoxy of orthodoxy being like a chariot. Heresy, he says, is boring. It's way easier to make sense of, but that's because it goes to one extreme or the other rather than keeping the synthesis. True Christian orthodoxy, he said, is like a chariot whirling this way and that, almost always falling off into this extreme or that extreme, but the adventure, the vitality, the wonder is that it remains upright. It avoids things that are simpler and easier to make sense of and keeps this rich mystery. That's what I think might offer some hope for our sense of crisis in this age. Thanks very much.